Hey guys, welcome back to Understanding Crypto. My name is Will, and today we're going to talk about the blockchain trilemma. Please remember, the content included in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not to be treated as financial advice, and I am not a financial advisor. If you do choose to invest in cryptocurrencies, then you should always do your own research. The blockchain trilemma, a phrase coined by the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, eloquently portrays the difficulty faced when developing blockchain networks. Blockchains strive to maximize their decentralization, security, and scalability, but often find themselves having to sacrifice one of these in order to achieve the others. It's historically been a game of trade-offs as to what each blockchain is trying to focus on. So let's take a look at the three different elements of the trilemma: decentralization, security, and scalability. Decentralization is really interesting. We're going to go into a bit more detail on this later on and look at some specific examples and how we measure this in more detail. But at high level, decentralization is just a view of how many entities it would take to control a network. Typically, you need 51% of the controlling power, whatever that power is, to corrupt the network. In the case of Bitcoin, this would be compute power or hash rate. In the case of proof of stake networks, this would be control over 51% of the coins or the native token of the stake. The more decentralized something is, typically the more secure it is. Brings us on to security. So what is security? So blockchain security is generally measured in terms of money in dollars. It's how much would it cost an attacker to take over the network, even just for a fraction of a second. So with Bitcoin, you would need to buy all the compute power, or take control of the compute power at least, and you would need to pay for the energy associated with that to get to the 51% hash rate. That's incredibly expensive for Bitcoin to do that as an individual or even as a country. For proof of stake, you've got to own 51% of the coins. So you've got to sort of be able to hack the network to get to that much ownership, or be able to collude with over 51% of the actors who control the stake, or the mining pools in the case of Bitcoin. So that sort of security ties decentralization, but ultimately generally tends to be measured in dollars spent to be able to hack a network, as opposed to just the number of entities which would need to collude, which is more of the decentralization metric. Scalability. So look, scalability tends to be the one that, this is the one that's key for future mass adoption. Blockchain isn't going to reach the world unless we can scale it, because when you've got Visa, MasterCard, all of our payment rails, all of our centralized systems that we have that are so convenient, so quick to use, and so cheap to use, how can blockchain compete if it's not scalable, if you can't do these transactions quickly? So it's really important that we scale. Now, when you scale, you tend to get the trade-offs with decentralization or security. So the decentralization tends to reduce as you scale more. The security, as a result, also tends to reduce as you scale more. Unless you can solve that, and we'll dive into different blockchains and how they attempt to solve this, or trying to at least, and what the future might hold. So these three elements: decentralization, security, scalability, are three key elements of the blockchain trilemma, and really define whether your blockchain is actually truly a decentralized system that could be like the future of everything, or if it's just an inefficient database in the sense masquerading as a blockchain, which some of the ones in the top 10 are doing that. So how do we measure decentralization? Well, what we're looking at here is a analytics page called Sea Explorer in the Cardano ecosystem. So this is a site that's got loads of really interesting information all about stake pools and all sorts of other metrics. But the particular tab we're on here is a view of the stake pools within the Cardano ecosystem. Now, there's a whole load of stake. I think it's about 22 billion ADA right now is staked, of a circulating supply of about 35 billion, and all that ADA is staked across approximately about 3,000 different stake pools. Now, what you can see here in this chart here in the top left, biggest groups by stake. This is a view of all the different stake pools and the stake allocated to it. Now, you've got up here single pool operators taking up 26% of all the staked ADA. Now, yeah, that seems like a lot, and it is, but we've got to remember here that there are many, many different stake pools, all different entities in this same bucket. It's a single pool, a single entity running a single pool. And in fact, if I just come over here, it looks like there's one to the right-hand side. It looks like there's 1,791. So almost 2/3 of the total number of pools are run by individual pool operators, and they hold, or at least they have delegated to them, about 26% of the total ADA staked. Now, the important part is this more extended semicircle on the bottom here, on the left-hand chart again, on this donut chart. There's actually 35 different sections here, which all represent different entities owning multiple pools. These are all multi-pool operators. So you have up here the Avengers pool controls, or has delegated to it, 1.6 billion ADA of staked ADA. In fact, I said it was delegated to it. In the case of Avengers, this is really Coinbase, their stake pools that they run behind the scenes. So they actually do control this ADA because it's a centralized exchange. The next one is the Binance stake pools. They've got 1 billion ADA there, so there's 92 pools, 35 pools in Coinbase. But the number of pools doesn't really matter to the same degree. It's the amount of stake. There's about 1.6 billion ADA in Coinbase and 1 billion ADA in Binance. Now, those two control just over 7% and 4.5%. So they control about 12.5% of the total staked ADA. Now, the remaining 33 entities, these are multi-pool operators operating on the Cardano blockchain. Individuals like myself, or anyone really, is able to delegate to these pools and take part in the consensus of the network consensus mechanism. And the security of the Cardano blockchain. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that with Cardano, there are actually 35 different entities that would be required to collude in order to take control of the network. And this is known as the Nakamoto coefficient. So Cardano has a very high, for such a big blockchain, a very high Nakamoto coefficient of 35. Meaning, again, 35 different entities have to collude in order to corrupt and manipulate and take control of the network. Now we're just going to flip over to this sort of similar view for Bitcoin. So this is from the pool stats on btc.com. Similar view here, the pie chart. Now what you can see here, what might be surprising, is actually you can see very quickly that there's just two different entities that control, looks like 55% of the hash rate. So that means Bitcoin has a Nakamoto coefficient of 2. So Foundry pool and Ant pool just need to collude and work together in order to basically manipulate that decentralized Bitcoin network. Now, there's a bit more detail behind this. These pools don't necessarily own all of the compute power and the hash rate that feeds into them. These are pools that basically individuals and entities delegate their computing power to remotely to work together to solve the proof of work problem, to then get the rewards for the next block every 10 minutes. So a user, a delegator of their hash power, can always remove themselves from the pool and start mining individually or delegating their hash power to another pool. It's more of a method of convenience to ensure that you're always going to consistently get rewards as a proportion of the hash power that you're putting into the system, into the Bitcoin protocol. So yes, Foundry and Ample could collude and do really whatever they wanted to with the Bitcoin network. However, very quickly, as soon as it got realized that's what was happening, they would lose a lot of their delegated sort of hash power. So that's the I guess that's the difference here. I mean, you'll hear quite often that Bitcoin maximalists will say it's the most decentralized network ever, and proof of work's the best. And there's a lot of pros to proof of work. There's a lot of pros to proof of stake. On the surface, proof of work, the Bitcoin Nakamoto coefficient does not look good because there are really two centralized entities that are controlling the majority of the hash power. Something to bear in mind, it's unlikely it would get acted on because as soon as Foundry or Ample did act on it or collude, the value of Bitcoin would be shaken so much it would plummet. It would be to anyone's advantage to do this. But that still doesn't stop the possibility that it could happen, however unlikely it is. So, Cardano, Nakamoto coefficient of 35, highly decentralized. Bitcoin, Nakamoto coefficient of 2, seemingly, although, as we just discussed, there are some nuances and caveats to that. Next up, I want to talk about something that will be coming out pretty soon, I hope. This is the Edinburgh Decentralisation Index. So this is a piece of work that's sponsored by or funded to some degree by IOG and other partners as well. And we'll have a look at the bottom and see the partners in a moment. But this is a university that is looking at a formal way to measure systematically and equally decentralization. So we've just talked about the Nakamoto coefficient for the last few minutes. There's other things you can look at to define decentralization. It could be the country, the jurisdiction that the mining pool is in, or the mining hash rate is in, or the stake is held in. It could be with some stake pools and mining pools, these are hosted on cloud providers. So you'll actually find that a lot of the stake or the hash power is sitting on AWS or Google Cloud or Azure or others, and that's something to consider too because they're centralizing entities. If AWS wanted to turn off their systems, they could. If they suddenly decided that they were going to ban any kind of crypto running on their cloud platforms, I suppose they could. That's a centralizing factor. So there's a lot of different things to consider with decentralization. It's not necessarily just the Nakamoto coefficient of individual entities on the surface. And this report, the intention is going to get continually updated and published and track the top blockchains and give like a rolling measure of different elements of their decentralization, roll it all up to an overall decentralization view. That the intention is hopefully that it can be used as a fair and sound basis for governments and individuals and companies to sort of really truly compare how decentralized the blockchain is. Because if you've been on crypto Twitter, you'll know as well as I have, as well as I do, that it's just there's so much tribalism, marketing, outright lies, anything to just try and make your tribalistic blockchain look and sound the best. So this really is very much needed. It's going to be a game changer, I think, for the industry and for regulation, governments, and just a general sort of view of how the market looks, or the market of decentralization looks, at least. So there's no date when this is going to get rolled out. Have a look at the website. It doesn't give too much away in terms of the dates, but it does talk about the vision, what they're trying to do. Let's just have a quick look at this. Why it's needed, the different ways, I suppose, that they go, or just outlining that they're going to look at many different metrics of decentralization as we just talked about here. So look, you see some of the partners down below, but ultimately this is going to be really, really important for the industry, and I have a feeling Cardano is going to do very well out of this. So let's take a look at some different scaling solutions. Let's look at Bitcoin, Cardano, and Ethereum. Bitcoin has high decentralization and high security. If we ignore the two pools that make the Nakamoto coefficient 2. And what Bitcoin struggles with is scaling. The blocks are every 10 minutes. The block size means that only a certain number of transactions can fit into those blocks, and so it drives high transaction fees if you want to get placed in the block. If we're going to onboard, millions to billions of people, this isn't going to work, and we need a solution to scale it. Now, there's an amazing book got written by a few years ago by a guy called James Beer, and it's called The Block Size Wars, and it describes the story of really Bitcoin from its inception up until the present day of the release, which I think was around about 2019, something like that. And it talks about all of Bitcoin's sort of scaling challenges and what's been done to try to help improve the speed of the network. And you have two different trains of thought within the Bitcoin world. You had those, ultimately, could be dropped into two buckets: small blockers and big blockers. Now, the big blockers wanted to increase the Bitcoin block size, and that really meant you could put more transactions into each block every 10 minutes. You were therefore able to reduce the transaction fees, and you're able to sort of make this a much quicker network and cheaper network. But in order to do this, you'd need to raise the hardware requirements for running a Bitcoin node. And that's all well and good, so long as the technology and the hardware you need is still cheap enough. Then there's the small blockers who wanted to keep the block size smaller and scale in different ways, if at all. And the reason why they wanted to do that, the small blockers, was because they really were fundamentally valued Bitcoin as, I guess, a pure decentralized network, and they were scared that by raising the block size, it could lead to a level of centralization within Bitcoin. And they felt there were better solutions to help scale the network. The big blockers ultimately had a vision of, maintaining decentralization, of course, but ultimately making Bitcoin a payments network. And this discussion still goes on. I mean, the small blockers won that war back in 2017. But this discussion still rolls on. In fact, it's come to prominence again more recently with the Bitcoin network becoming a little bit more congested, or a lot more congested, with the release of the ordinals NFTs. The network is highly congested. Transaction fees are very high again, and we're about to enter the next bull market as of now, in probably a few months' time. So that's sort of the history of Bitcoin, and I think, very, very, very high level history there of the block sizes. And but Bitcoin still needs a scaling solution, and it has had a solution called the Lightning Network, which you may have heard of. And the Lightning Network is essentially a layer 2 solution, or a state channels solution, where a user can essentially move their funds to the Lightning Network. It's decentralized to a degree. I don't know all the details of it. I need to do a bit more research on this, to be honest. But it allows sort of quick transactions between individuals who open up a channel with each other. So I could send you money, you could send me money for a fraction of the cost that would actually cost on the Bitcoin network once we'd opened up or paid the transaction fee to open up a channel between us. And that basically means that we can kind of keep a ledger of account between you and I on the Lightning Network without actually making a transaction. It's sort of just recorded in the Lightning Network. And then whenever one of us wants to sort of cash out, a single transaction occurs to cash out and takes the balance. Now, I might have given you some money, you might give me some money, and so on, and these net off each other. And whatever the remaining balance is at the end, when we close that state channel, that's how it kind of works. So it's quite a neat solution. I think you can have businesses running on the Lightning Network. You could have sort of lots of entities and people running on the network, which can sort of facilitate a whole payments network between people, so long as there's enough liquidity there in this network of channels between people. Lightning has had some flaws and some controversy. But in principle, that's how Bitcoin has been trying to scale, using a layer 2 solution and not making the L1, the layer 1 Bitcoin network scale, for fear of centralizing it to a degree. And instead, that has been pushed to the layer 2, where, as an end user, as a customer of the Bitcoin network, I actually then have to sort of take some level of risk by moving my funds to a more centralized network, being the Lightning Network. What's Ethereum doing? Well, Ethereum is having the same challenges with scaling. They've got high transaction fees, the network's congested, they're struggling to scale the L1. In fact, they've pretty much abandoned the roadmap to scale the layer 1 Ethereum network. And what Ethereum is trying to do now is build out a whole layer 2 ecosystem, similar but different to the Lightning Network, where essentially you can move your ETH and your tokens in a wrapped form to a much more centralized layer 2 network, where there aren't the same level of nodes, there isn't the same level of security or decentralization, but the scalability is much, much higher. So if we think back to the trilemma discussion we've had, these layer 2s are sacrificing decentralization and security for scalability. And then that means that me as an end user of ETH, I am taking the risk by moving my Ethereum essentially to a blockchain that I know isn't very decentralized, that can sort of switch off, or they can take my funds. But I'm trusting them not to. But I know the transaction fees are much more sustainable for me as an end user. I just have to take that risk of trust, which is almost the opposite of what blockchain's about to some degree. But this is how Ethereum is planning to scale, by building a network of layer 2s that sit on top of the Ethereum layer 1. Now, Cardano, on the other hand, is taking a different approach for the most part. They are really trying to scale the layer 1. And this is, again, one of the many reasons why I like Cardano so much. They're taking a very scientific and peer-reviewed approach to doing this, and there's a lot of upgrades coming. Input endorsers being one that I'm particularly excited about, as well as Hydra, which is already sort of live and rolling out in increments on the network, to scale that layer 1. Now, Cardano, of course, is going to have its layer 2 ecosystem as well, but it's going to tackle this in both ways. So there will be layer 2 protocols where you can move your ADA and your tokens to run much faster, and where use cases require it to run much faster and scalable solutions. But Cardano isn't abandoning scaling the layer 1. And if this works, then Cardano has solved the blockchain trilemma of being a decentralized, secure, and scalable blockchain. That's really the holy grail of what we're all about. So guys, that's it for this video on the blockchain trilemma. If you like the video, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and click that bell icon too. Thanks, and see you next time.